If you've watched my videos for a while, then you've likely seen my original Starfield video, which was titled something like How to Enjoy Starfield, in which I attempted to describe how to best optimize your playthrough by focusing on the pieces of the game that are interesting, unique, and fully fleshed out. The main focus of which was to invest in the rogue space traveler adventure fantasy of building a powerful ship, then upgrading it in a straightforward way that would synergize well with your progression through investing in the correct series of skills that would streamline your ship part unlocks, rather than investing in other skills like the convoluted and unrewarding crafting skills, which leaves you with a generic ship that you'll likely not feel any sort of attachment to. To me, the strongest piece of Starfield's design that gives it a unique feel compared to other Bethesda games is its ship systems, which offers you the opportunity to essentially play out the fantasy of piloting throughout the galaxy, gaining skills and money along the way until you've designed the greatest starship in the galaxy, a Millennium Falcon of your own design, or Starship Enterprise, or Star-Lord's Milano, some kind of smuggling, fighting, or leisure vehicle that you'll have designed both inside and out, creating a base of operations that fits your needs that you can take with you wherever you go. Outside of this star-traveling fantasy, the game is really pretty unrefined and bland, with 1,000 planets full of procedurally generated nonsense, all offering you the opportunity to collect resources which only serve to promote the dogshit crafting systems. Despite its faults, the gameplay loop I had found within the Starship Captain fantasy left me craving more, and had me wishing at several points throughout the last year that the game would receive a substantial update that would revitalize the game as a whole and provide the framework necessary to indulge in the incredible space adventure that's hidden beneath Starfield's abundance of shoddy design choices. I also described within my original video how my enjoyment of Starfield and my willingness to forgive its lesser aspects is largely based on it being part of Xbox's Games Pass. I never had to purchase the game, and so any and all of the value I got from the game was essentially a net gain for me, and I didn't have to weigh it against a price tag. And I really felt the divide between my own opinions of the game and the comments left by people who had purchased the game, who were left to attempt to get the most out of a disappointing purchase. And so I eventually came to describe Starfield as a great game, but a terrible product. If Starfield was sold for like $20 and was sold as an early access title, the same price that Ark Survival Evolved cost within its early access phase, I think many people would have received the game much better. If there were watermarks at the corner of the screen within the procedurally generated planet areas saying "content coming soon," then I don't think that anyone would have cared to comment on the bland, boring nature of the lesser aspects of the game. However, that's all in hindsight, and all we can really do is look at the events that have unfolded and analyze what we got, which is a huge ripoff, with a really fun and interesting gameplay loop that's only accessible through investing in the game enough to fulfill its Starship fantasy potential. And now we're at an impasse where the question becomes, do you feel the need to spend $30 more to flesh out that experience further? Is it worth the risk of investing in a known ripoff to potentially squeeze more of the unique greatness out of this mess of a title? And the answer is a resounding fuck no. Bethesda was smart to advertise this content as a story expansion, which gives them the out to say, well, it wasn't an expansion of the game, it was an expansion of the game's story. And make no mistake, that is all that there is to this content. A story expansion to a game that doesn't really have any story whatsoever. Starfield exists in the same style of narrative as vanilla Destiny 1, where there isn't really anything going on in this universe at the moment we enter it, which I think is best highlighted by the intro of the game being an arbitrary instance of you, a random miner, touching a magic rock, and then being given a free spaceship as though it was trash nobody wanted. I've always been terribly annoyed by this moment, which undercuts the value of your ship, making it seem entirely devoid of any personal attachment, and therefore not worth investing in. It's not even your ship, it's borrowed to you with the expectation that you'll be giving it back, but you're never confronted with that reality. And so, rather than having an intro that glorifies the only interesting aspect of this game, making the ship systems seem like something you'll really want to invest in, the game sweeps the value of obtaining a fucking spacecraft under the rug, and therefore makes the game seem as though its space aspects will be negligible, and instead focuses on the main story quest, a bunch of fetch quests that will have you finding a bunch more magic space rocks. because there's nothing else of note happening in the galaxy. There's no great war going on, no factions butting heads preparing for conflicts that you as the main character might sway in one direction or another. No immediate threat you'll have to face, no impending doom for your people, no family member or friend to save, no call to adventure. You're just some dickhead who touched a rock, and now you're asked to find more of them by a nerd fan club who arbitrarily gave you a free spaceship with no strings attached. And sure, the main story, spoilers, eventually opens up into a multiversal situation, where every new game cycle puts you into a new universe as a Starborn in that universe, which is admittedly a cool concept. But that comes at the cost of deleting your interesting and personally designed spaceship just to give you the generic boring Starborn ship. Trading your Millennium Falcon for a carbon copy spaceship, which you've destroyed several of within your original New Game cycle. And so, the main storyline missions are boring trash that you'll likely avoid and therefore ignore the multiversal plot. The factions are at peace, and the only conflict comes in the form of space pirates in one form or another, that you can't even consider joining without sacrificing just about everything in the entire game, because the bad guys of this game are so minimal and pushed to the edges of the settled systems that they're hardly a threat to space society at all. Like vanilla Destiny, there's basically no moving pieces whatsoever in this world. However, Destiny at bare minimum offered us a world at its lowest, with nowhere to go but up, whereas Starfield is set in an almost completely peaceful galaxy, with missions and stories that have virtually no stakes, because everything is basically going to end up where it began no matter what, back to peace and understanding of one another. The way I see it, Shattered Space could have gone down one of two ways. It could have been a systemic overhaul to the game, fleshing out the lesser bits and strengthening the aspects of the game that work well. Or it could just be an expansion to a bloated, boring mess of a game, inflating its total price tag, and in turn making the game as a whole feel that much more of a ripoff. And somehow, Bethesda has managed to find an even worse case scenario for themselves. Shattered Space is not only just an expansion, but it's also just a story expansion, which expands the same insanely boring, peaceful society dynamic that every other settled system planet has. The Varun faction was set up to us throughout the base game as extremist religious zealots, and after hearing that they would be the focus of this DLC, I couldn't help but to be excited at the idea of an expansion that would thrust you into an enemy faction society that exists outside of the settled systems. There's about 1,000 different interesting ways that this content could have turned out, especially so when you add the space magic of their great serpent god essentially being real and having physical effects on this planet. Bethesda instead chose the absolute most boring way imaginable to approach this faction. You see, the zealots of House Varun are zealots even to the people of House Varun, and after a long drawn-out introduction, you're jumped straight to their mysterious and hidden home planet, and you're basically welcomed with open arms through a series of arbitrary instances of you being the chosen one. There's no oppression of the outsider, no jailbreak sequence, no forming of trust between you and these people, no heroic or adventurous moments. Instead, you just happen to be able to speak to their ghost leader, and within 2 steps on this planet, you're already Lisan al-Gaib of the Space Muslims, and you'll spend the next 20 minutes of your life mashing through dialogue so that everything going on can be explained to you. And I think that this is a perfect microcosmic example of the bland, beige-colored content that absolutely ruins Starfield's potential. At its best, you'll fly into an unknown planet at the request of a distress signal, only to find a unique situation unfolding at your destination, which can be uncovered and understood with a combination of exploration, visual storytelling, and bits of dialogue through characters that know little more than you do. This works very similarly to a Fallout vault where some kind of calamity has happened and you'll figure out the reasons for it as you explore. Some of the better examples of this are within the planet where an artifact has separated a facility into 2 dimensions. One where only a single man survived and the facility has been overtaken by insect creatures, and one where only that one man died, but you'll have to overcome the functioning security systems of the facility. In order to overcome obstacles and enemies, you'll have to warp between dimensions and ultimately decide which dimension becomes the true dimension after removing the artifact and deleting the dimension that you're not currently in. There's interesting mechanics at play, unique level design, and a moral question that's left for you to decide on. It's definitely a highlight of the collecting the artifacts quest. There's also the planet with the settlement inhabited by famous historical figures, who had been cloned here over and over each time they died. Ultimately, you're tasked with taking down the cloning facility and deciding what to do with it, and who of the historical figures should be in charge, including FDR and Genghis Khan. However, outside of the better instances of content, the worst of Starfield will have you entering the most peaceful and civil conflicts of all time, in situations that have to be explained to you in extreme detail and will ultimately be resolved through dialogue options. And this whole DLC leans so far in that direction that your introduction to the extremist, isolationist, religious fanatic faction is them accepting you into their society. Not only that, but a large part of this DLC revolves around gathering the three houses of House Varun, having them work together despite their differences being utterly non-existent. These three houses are completely indistinguishable from one another, both aesthetically and ideologically, because the conflict and intrigue here is completely manufactured. There's like 25 total NPCs here within this one settlement who all act, look, and sound alike and all have the same religion. And you're expected to be immersed within this group enough to see them as individual factions and pretend that their grudges against one another are valid and developed. But there's just nothing here, and the most insulting thing is that you, as the chosen one, are supposed to decide which of the three houses should rule at the end of the campaign. And the game just leaves you there to stare at three assholes, which you'll likely not even know which house they belong to, nor care what the implications of your decision might be. I chose the option I'll be in charge, which they shot down, and I found myself wishing that there was a megaton bomb at the center of this settlement, so that I might make a single choice that mattered at all in this RPG. And that pretty much covers everything I have to say about the story elements of this story expansion. It's all bland, boring garbage that's poorly written and lacks a single character of interest. It follows the most predictable narrative of all time, with the ghost leader of the extremist group turning out to be a fanatical asshole who wants to crusade the galaxy. Who could have seen that coming? And it kills the potential of this whole section of the lore, making it so that the key players within the world of Starfield now consist of the United Colonies, the good guys who refuse to use mechs anymore because that would be bad, the Freestar Alliance, good guys who refuse to use xeno-weapons anymore because that would be bad, and now House Varun, good guys who disown and condemn their zealots because they're being bad. This whole game's narrative is completely sterilized so that nothing of note is happening at all throughout the entire galaxy. The enemies of this game come down to random pirates, non-threatening alien wildlife, and robots, and I just cannot fathom having the entirety of the galaxy as your canvas. And this is all the creativity that Bethesda has to show to us. Anyway, let's cover what's left of the DLC without the story aspects. You get like 10 new weapons, 5 new enemies, a single new settlement, and a handful of new procedurally generated planets in a game with a fucking 1,000 procedurally generated planets. The entirety of the DLC, however, will exist within one single planet in the one single area around the main settlement of that planet. It's interesting to note that you can actually see by looking at the map the limit of the play area of the real DLC area before it fades into procedurally generated garbage. That you'll have to grind if you want the legendary versions of the new weapons. Now you can play this whole DLC without flying your ship once, and with that in mind, I just want you to look at this square of map that makes up the complete play area of this expansion, a large part of which serves the same function as 10 other settlement planets with vendors, healers, bars, and armories, and just try to keep in mind that this amount of content costs $30. And aside from wildlife, the only threat you'll come across within this area are player model humans, both in the standard Varun Zealot variety, as well as the new teleporting horror-type humans, which once dead become regular Zealot character models anyway. You have the Redeemed, which I guess are just dudes with exosuits who attempt to melee you, and you have the horror scorpion enemies, which teleport and attempt to melee you. That's every new enemy type added in this DLC, and they're all just basic plays on shit that already exists, but some now teleport. and they're all just arbitrarily immune to your Fosro-Da gravity blast power. For difficulty reasons, I guess. I would say that I got bored of fighting them, but the DLC just isn't all that long, so you won't have the chance to get tired of them. The new weapons introduced are all just fine. Some of them are pretty powerful, which is nice, but it really doesn't add all that much to the whole game, because there's not enough interesting content in the base game to bother bringing the cool new weapons into, especially so when the DLC content is recommended level 35. At that point, you've likely seen everything you care to see within the base game, and so you'll likely only be using the new weapons for the few hours you put into the DLC, if you can manage to find rare enough varieties to make them worth your while. And that's the biggest, most insulting thing about this content. It is such an isolated experience that gives nothing back to the base game, doesn't build off of anything of value from the base game, and costs half the price of the base game. There isn't a single new space battle within the DLC. There isn't a single new ship part within the DLC. There is absolutely no spacefaring adventure contained within the DLC. Shattered Space is trying so fucking hard to be a Dawn Guard, a Skyrim-style expansion that returns to form, giving you a single new play area, with some new quests and weapons. And that is nothing but a misguided and insecurity-driven attempt to win back people who were never going to give Starfield another chance anyway, unless there were to be a massive systemic overhaul to the game that grants a cyberpunk-esque comeback. But for that to ever be accomplished, the game would have to impress its current audience so much that their hype inspires the more mainstream casual player to consider returning. Bottom line, Shattered Space wasn't made with Starfield fans in mind. It wasn't made with unique aspects of Starfield's design in mind. It sells out all of that to appeal to an audience that doesn't exist. To even set foot on this new planet, your barrier to entry will include spending more money on Starfield, which is already a touchy subject that most people will be unwilling to do, but you're also recommended to be level 35, which is no small task within a really fucking boring game. I have little doubt that anyone with a character above level 30 has done some amount of investing within the ship systems, and likely wants to indulge in the space fantasy that the game promised. And so the only people who will actually reach the DLC are players who like Starfield, and the only content within the DLC seems to be made for people who hate Starfield. It almost feels like a pathetic apology to their lost players, an embarrassing voicemail wailing, "Please come back, I can change," but the people meant to hear it have already blocked their number. I wanted this game to succeed so badly, and not because I was hyped for it or I need to justify my purchase or I'm a Bethesda fanboy, but purely because I really enjoy the idea of this game. The space fantasy adventure with limitless freedom, but only if you're willing to face the dangers that await you across the cosmos. Throughout the last year, I've returned to this game dozens of times, wishing that the content would be worth playing. Because to me, the concept scratches an itch harder than Fallout or Elder Scrolls ever has. I just love space shit. But the execution of this game has been utterly incompetent, and after this DLC, I don't see that changing anytime soon. It seems like the negativity surrounding Starfield's release sent Bethesda into a spiral, the same AAA studio paralysis we've seen many times before in the industry, where the changes made to the game are entirely focused on backtracking to change the negative opinion of the game, rather than fleshing out the original vision of the game. The solution to procedurally generated planets being really boring shouldn't have been to implement a rover that reduces the time you'll have to spend in the boring areas. It should have been to make the boring areas less boring. Just add random reskins of dragons from Skyrim or Deathclaws from Fallout into the boring areas, along with powerful weapon drops upon their defeat. And I guarantee that players will grind that content rather than ignore it, especially so if there was specific sets of weapons dropped on specific planets. If the space travel is boring, instead of making a DLC that ignores space travel entirely, maybe implement a system that randomly loads powerful enemy player-made ships into battle with you, and have them exist as a faction of aspiring Starborn. Instead of just fighting overpowered but also cookie-cutter fights with the Starborn ships, which don't drop anything upon their defeat, you could have a nearly infinite supply of unique player-tested spaceships that would take like hours to code in and some server space. And you can make these fights rewarding by dropping that player's most used weapon upon their ship's defeat or something like that. The thing is, this game will never work without the implementation of creative ideas. But instead, Bethesda seems to be focused on streamlining the game and ignoring the fact that it's just boring right now. This DLC was the most boring part of Starfield I've played so far, forcing you to endless dialogue and mindless fighting, all without the reprieve you might get from a mid-quest space battle. I still really want this game to be great someday, to fulfill the promise of its space adventure, but I just don't believe in Bethesda anymore. Shattered Space was the nail in that coffin. It really should have been called Shattered Faith.